Hey, welcome back. You got Laura, and this week we're looking at factors that affect learning and development, and specifically intervention techniques and how and where we would do those interventions. More or less, we're talking about the placement process this week, which tends to be can be a pretty problematic, stressful, and emotional topic for all parties involved, and it's got a lot of different angles to it. So let's take a look at a couple of things. When we're talking about settings and placement options, it's really interesting for a person like me because I work in 13 different school districts, and all of them have sort of different expectations. Typically within the same county you would have the same rules, but not necessarily. So for example, in my county we have Livonia Public Schools, and in Livonia Public Schools we have a cross-categorical program which has children with a variety of learning disabilities. It tends to be sort of milder learning disabilities, like a mild cognitive impairment or a severe learning disability. And in those classrooms there are about 12 to 15 students, one teacher and one paraeducator. We also, of course, have the general education option with resource room. And in addition to that, in Livonia we house our county autism center-based program, which is a classroom for students with autism with 7 students, one teacher, and 2 paraeducators. Typically the ratio, as you know, is 5 to 1. And then you start adding paraprofessional staff after you get past 5. So in Livonia we have all 3 of those options. But other districts in our county do not necessarily have those options. Only a few of us have a county-based program. Of course, if you live in a different district, you can send a student to the county-based program. But some of the districts in our county don't have the cross-categorical option. In other words, if they can have a student with autism either in their gen ed setting, or they can put them on a bus and send them over to one of the ASD classrooms. And the difficulty with that for those districts, the reason for that is that they're a district that embraces the philosophy of inclusive education, and they try to keep most, if not the vast majority of their students educated in the mainstream. The difficulty is that when they get a student with autism who's not considered to be severe enough to qualify for one of the center-based programs for students with ASD, they then are tasked with having that that student in a gen ed classroom, whereas we in Livonia would probably have that student in a cross-categorical special education classroom. So there are a little bit of differences in terms of your founding principles and the way that the districts like to do things. So you kind of have to look at it very individually when we're talking about the placement process. But it all boils down to federal legislation and IDEA and the expectation that we will be providing free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. So there should be, by law, an offer of a continuum of services, and as I just described, that continuation might be different from district to district, but there should be a continuum of services ranging from fully included in the gen ed setting all the way up to a combined self-contained classroom or something in between. Might be like a cross-categorical setting or layering on the resources. When we start to make decisions about this, and this week you have in your participation some of the steps for the placement process where I live, and you'll be discussing what the steps for the placement process is for where you live. But some of the things that you have to take into consideration are, what does your district have? You know, what's available in the community? If your district doesn't have a program for students with autism, does your county or your outlying area have services or a program for students with autism? And is that an option for your student? What are the criteria? What are the eligibility requirements? Also, obviously, you have to take into consideration the student's developmental level and learning needs. As we know, students with autism range anywhere from gifted and very high functioning and very capable all the way down to nonverbal and severely cognitively impaired. Now, I have some districts that I work with who are under the impression that if you have an eligibility of autism, that automatically gets you into an AI program or a program for students with autism. And that's not really appropriate. As we know, many students with autism, probably the vast majority of students with autism, can and should be educated in a less restrictive environment, probably in the gen ed setting. When we're talking about Asperger's syndrome, the vast majority of students with autism are included in the general education setting. So we're not necessarily looking at a special education program. But then again, when you're working in a district that believes in full inclusion and you have a student with more moderate to severe forms of autism, you have to be able to look at that student's needs and program appropriately for it. I do run into from time to time in those inclusive districts that they're not set up for and they're not prepared for the needs of this child, and they don't have the services available for that particular child, so they have to kind of reach out to their county supports for that. And a third thing that comes into play is can be a monkey wrench. Tends to be the family priorities and concerns. So sometimes the IEP team, and this is where it starts to get emotional, sometimes the IEP team, meaning the educational piece of the IEP team, keeping in mind that parents are a part of that team too, sometimes the educators feel differently than the parents. Sometimes the educators feel that the student should be in a more restrictive environment like a center-based classroom. And the parents say, no thank you, I really want my student educated with all of his peers. And what it comes down to is if the parents feel strongly about that, the district 9.9 times out of 10 is not going to go to court about that. They will try and support that student in a general education setting, and that's both legal, ethical, and appropriate. So it's very possible that you may find yourself in a situation with a student that you feel and the other members of your teaching team feel should be included in a special education program, but this student is in a general education program, and you are required to put together some very difficult programming for this student, and it can be very, very problematic. But it is something that tends to come up pretty frequently in my world. There's a lot to be said for including students with autism in a general ed setting, and the inclusionists that I know and the people who feel very strongly about inclusion would argue these points here. In an inclusive setting, you have more opportunities to observe the appropriate behaviors from students who are not impaired, neurotypical students. And if you think about autism as a social and behavioral disorder and a language disorder, and you consider when you put those students in a classroom with like peers, how can they learn in context those appropriate social and language behaviors? And there's only, you can sit them down with a speech pathologist, you can sit them down with a social worker, you can do all sorts of direct interventions, but if you're not teaching that in the context in which it occurs by the appropriate social models, children never learn these techniques appropriately. So that's one of the biggest arguments for inclusive education. Something to take into consideration when you're looking for inclusion opportunities, you may not have a student who's fully included, but maybe you are mainstreaming or including out from a special education setting. A lot of times, I wonder if this is true where you are, but where I am, it's pretty common practice to include kids for specials. For whatever reason, somebody has it in their head that specials is going to be a more successful time for the student with autism. That's almost never the case in my experience. I don't know where that idea came from, but my experience is if you try to put a kid with ASD into art, music, and gym sometimes is successful, but sometimes it's really problematic. You've got this big open room, there's not enough structure, they want to do what they want to do, they're not following the classroom routine. The specials teachers tend to be the least trained out of anyone, and so they get really overwhelmed with how to program for students with ASD. So that tends to be where people in my area anyway like to do inclusion. But what you really need to do is take into consideration the student's strengths and interests. This kid might be a really high reader. Could we include him during reading? He might be really great at math. Let's put him into the math section. Maybe he's really good at organizing. Can he go into the classroom and be the classroom organizer for the art supplies in the arts room? Things like that to take into consideration. And also, the idea of providing services to better support children with autism was also discussed in that chapter in talking about, when you put them into that classroom setting, into that general education setting, you still have to provide several different types of interventions, and those techniques need to be trained in that setting. So the thing to consider is how can you support that student in the gen ed setting? And again, different districts have different supports. In some districts that I go to, they have both a resource room teacher and a teacher consultant in every building, as well as a speech pathologist. In other districts, they have one speech pathologist that goes to 8 different buildings, so she's rarely around, but they have a social worker in every building. So you have to kind of think about what does your local building have in place for putting these interventions in place, and how will that student be supported by that by that staff. Very often the student will have a paraeducator who works with them. But how do you use the paraeducator? Is the paraeducator trained and supervised? Who's supervising the paraeducator, and what exactly is she expected to do with the student? We now have an expectation that the paraeducator will be using evidence-based strategies and will be taking data on those evidence-based strategies, and then the educational team, meaning the resource room teacher, the speech pathologist, whoever we have in that building, they're the ones who are creating those evidence-based strategies for the student and then training the paraeducator to implement it. So it's not without its problems and difficulty, including a student, obviously, in general education can be very challenging and problematic. So you really have to kind of think through how that's going to happen in your world. Then you've got your self-contained programs in classrooms, and again, those can be local self-contained classrooms, like just a larger sized special education classroom within your district, or a center-based classroom. In my area, we actually have the continuum goes one step farther. We have self-contained classrooms for students with ASD in general education buildings, like many of you probably do. And then we also have a more restrictive environment that is a school for students with autism that are at the most severe end of the spectrum. So we have it kind of all the way up to that gamut. And some of the pros and cons of this are that you have the inclusionists again would say that here we have limited access to typically developing peers. One of the attractions, by the way, to the School for Children with Autism, the one that has no typically developing peers, is many parents consider that to be a safer option for students when they're concerned about ideas like bullying and so forth, and being included in a culture or curriculum. The School for Students with Autism that I go to, it's called Berger Elementary School, and it's in Garden City, Michigan. And when I go there, they have their own Cub Scout groups, they have their own basketball teams, and everything there is designed for the students with autism. So they have their own culture, community, and world. So there's things to be said about that. And in those environments, you're probably not working as much on social interventions as you would be in a gen ed setting. You're working more on the academic skills at the appropriately modified level for the student with ASD. Typically, if you're not in that most severe continuum or the most restrictive continuum, like I talked about, you would have some opportunities to interact with typically developing peers. You're in a general education building typically. There's recess, there's lunch. Sometimes we do peer buddies, and you have a lot of crossover options, so you have some ability to teach those social skills and communication skills in context. Some of the other setting considerations and continuum issues are at the highest end of the continuum. A student would be in general education. Well, it's not quite the highest. I do have students with autism who are in general ed and who have no services. They're very, very limited services. But more commonly at the high end of the spectrum, they probably would have resource room services. In other words, they're included in a general education classroom, but they might need to go down to the resource room for sensory breaks, for motor breaks, or to have some direct instruction on things that they might have some difficulty with. Or the resource room teacher might be consulting with the classroom teacher and making accommodations and modifications to the student's curriculum within the gen ed setting. That's typically how a resource room works. I know many of you are probably resource room teachers. And another thing that was discussed in the chapter was the idea of home-based intervention. Now, understand that typically only happens for preschool-aged kids, and the reason for that is that, and usually that's early on services like 0 to 3, and those are usually home-based because that's the natural context, and that is the least restrictive environment for students under the age of 3 years old. So sometimes it'll happen a little bit older with older students, and there is some benefit from this, but typically they are serviced in a school setting, and we're talking about more training and support to parents so that kids can be learning in their natural context. As kids start to get a little bit older, we start to branch out into the community a little bit more, and we're looking at job placement opportunities and job coaching and getting them out there into the community. So you see a lot more community-based instruction happening. This doesn't mean that kids don't have school-based instruction, but we are starting to move them toward the work world in a kind of a natural transition there. As far as the idea of what we're teaching to kids, what's the curriculum that we're teaching, IDEA tells us that all students, all learners will have access to the curriculum. There is only one curriculum, and that's the general education curriculum. So whatever the neurotypical kids are learning, our kids should be learning with appropriate accommodations and modifications. So we understand that. But in addition to that, our kids need that curriculum plus a few other things. Starting with particularly the social and communication skills that are a deficit for people with autism. That has to be built into their curriculum in some way. Typically we'll use a speech pathologist to help us with that, and she would design an intervention, and perhaps that would be carried out by other members of the team or trained by herself. Other areas that we would build into the curriculum are play and leisure skills. Kids with ASD have a very different form of play, or they don't know how to play at all, and so they look very different from other kids. Anytime you have unstructured time for kids with ASD, it's their worst nightmare because they don't know what to do, so they end up getting themselves into all sorts of trouble during hallway passing times, at recess, indoor and outdoor recess, gym, and things like that. So a lot of times we have to actually train them how to play appropriately, and that's part of their curriculum. Then it gets built into their goals and objectives. Another thing that tends to need goals and objectives are self-help skills and adaptive skills, things like how to work independently, how to sit at your desk independently, how to organize your materials, how to operate your locker, dressing skills, but particularly for younger children, eating skills and managing your lunchbox and things, managing the lunchroom. There is a never-ending list of self-help and adaptive skills that frequently need to be addressed with students and with ASD. Then we have the issues of self-advocacy and coping skills. This is something that I spend a ton of time on. A lot of my higher functioning students in Gen Ed really have a hard time managing frustration or responding to bullying or tattling on their peers, and there's a lot of dysfunctional behavior that comes out of that. There's tantrums and tattling and just rude voices and things like that. So we do things like we build in self-management skills, something like the Incredible 5-point scale. We train the student how to manage his own frustration, teach him what he can do instead of having a meltdown. So that's a big piece of what we do, and that's an external curriculum thing. Now, typically who teaches this self-advocacy and coping skills, again, that's probably an extended team member like your speech pathologist or your social worker. It's not typically something that's going to fall on a general ed classroom teacher who has 30 students and is managing the general ed curriculum. So all of these external curriculum ideas are things that external members of the extended team will facilitate. Then you have the functional application of academic and cognitive skills. We do sometimes not think of our students with autism as dysfunctional learners because some of them are so bright and high functioning, but many of our students have peculiar learning disabilities. Typically when we have our kids in the Gen Ed setting and they go into the resource room teacher tends to know how to adapt and modify the curriculum for these kids because she does it for children with learning disabilities. That's what her area of expertise is. And children with autism don't really have that significant of a learning style difference necessarily than a student with a learning disability. As long as you keep the sensory pieces in mind, those things tend to be true. But what I did do for you is in your supplements area, you have a few things that kind of talk about how to make modifications and accommodations and where to make those things in a classroom setting. Another thing that tends to be an added piece to the curriculum sometimes for kids with autism is motor skills. Some of our students have weak fine motor skills. They have difficulty with handwriting and dressing and all of those small motor issues. Occasionally there are gross motor issues, more likely to be like a clumsy, awkward gait kind of a thing. Excuse me, let me bring this back. I don't know why this does this sometimes. And we are almost back. Yes, we're back. So sometimes those motor skills need to be addressed, and again, often we would have an extended team member in the form of an occupational therapist who would be involved with those things. Next in our reading, we start to talk about the idea of really having structured transition planning. And this is a really big deal because transitions for our kids, not to sound, trite, but transitions are a really big deal. And I don't mean transition from activity to activity, but life transitions, big transitions. One of the transitions that I've had a lot of experience with my students and their families is the early childhood transition. Students would come into the program that I was working in from the either from outside on the street or from the toddler program where the parents were able to be with them at home or in their school setting. And they come into the preschool setting where now it's big boy school, mommy, and you don't get to come to school. And a lot of times, we had kids who'd never sat in a chair before, who had never sat at circle time before. We had to teach them all of that. They'd never been expected to walk together in a hallway before. They'd certainly never done a locker routine or a cubby routine before. And then we had parents who had never let their child go before, who had to separate from their children. So we had a lot of problems with those kinds of transitions that we had to problem solve. And then when they left us and would go to an elementary program, we were dealing with a whole new set of stressors. And that was from the early childhood idea that intensive intervention and individual therapy and outcomes at the age of 5, he's going to look better if we do A, B, C, and D and all this ABA and all of these different interventions. So what happens with a lot of my parents at the age of 5, when they're moving up to elementary level, parents panic because students aren't fixed, they're not cured, oh my God, and now I'm entering big boy school, and we're going to go into the big boy school, and the kids have to go to lunch, and they have to go to recess, and they have to go to gym, and they might get bullied, and it's a very, very scary transition. And then we have the students, aspect of having to manage all of those new things in their lives too, not to mention, a full day versus a half day of preschool. So those are all big issues that we have to program for. We have to plan for that. We have to start on the front end. And how about the idea of going from one teacher who knows you, who knows all your quirks, knows all your ins and outs, to a new teacher and a new building that you don't know anything about and that doesn't know anything about you. So we do a lot of very highly structured programming for that. They talked specifically about the transition from the preschool to the elementary that I just kind of described. One of the things that is helpful to include is a transition evaluation, identifying what does the child like? What are all the things he's good at? What are the things he likes to do? How can you implement that into the curriculum? I like to have teachers from the receiving program come over to the sending program and spend some time observing the student in the classroom. Nowadays we take a lot of video as well. There are written reports and things from the sending teacher and the sending team. There are several steps to an effective transition plan that you can put in place to make that a little less bumpy. And he looks at too, it points out, it's not just transition, the smaller level transitions, switching from teacher to teacher, maybe switching to specials, switching from one end of the building to another, all of those things that are things that have to be thought of and programmed for. One of the issues that I had come up recently in a classroom of students with autism, it's a pretty severe classroom of students with autism, is a young man kept having these meltdowns. He was dropping to the floor. He was exhibiting some OCD behaviors that he hadn't done so severely in the past before. Now, they did a functional behavior assessment. They collected some data, and what they determined was it only happens during transitions, and during transitions to recess, during transitions to lunch, during transitions to the bus. Anytime this child had to transition any place new, it was very clearly about transitions. The answer to that is always visual schedules. And that's just evidence-based practice, and if you have a kid who has issues with transitions, then the answer is visual schedules. Well, I go into this ASD classroom, and guess what they're not using? Here it is, nonverbal, low-functioning students with autism, and we have no visual schedules, no first-then strips, no transition cards, no nothing. And we've got this kid having these major meltdowns, and the teacher starts having these conversations with, well, he shouldn't belong in this kind of school, he should go in the more severe school. And the reality is, all you needed to do was do a better job of programming for transitions. So we got that in place for him, and within days, actually, his behavior got better just with the use of visuals. That's just a little aside for you. Next, the chapter went into some of the transition issues that are specific to middle and high school. And here's where we start to look at vocational training and what kind of jobs is this student going to be able to do. And we're even beginning to think about what independent living skills this student needs. Does he need to learn how to wash his own clothes, to cook his own food? What type of house can he be living in? And some of this transition involves conversations with the families to start them really thinking about, where is this student going to live as an adult? What kinds of planning do you have to have in place for this student as he moves into adulthood? So there's quite a bit discussed there. And these are things actually that by law are required to be put into your IEP. People that participate in transition planning, in addition to the teachers and the parents, might be community members. Oftentimes OTs and social workers will be involved in that planning process, and in many districts we have job coaches and paraeducators who go out into the field with students as we start to kind of think about this transition toward adulthood. Finally, the chapter talked about the idea of planning and programming transitions into adulthood and graduation from high school. In the state of Michigan, we're pretty unique because we actually go to the age of 26. The rest of the country, I think, is pretty much talking about the age of 21, where we're still programming for adult age students who are not quite ready to transition into adulthood. So here the focus is beyond the academic and 100% on functional life skills and vocational training. Okay, switching gears, the chapter next talks about when we are planning for students and the interventions that they need in whichever settings. We are thinking about the IEP team, or the team that does the planning for these interventions, and who are the players on this team. The first thing that we look at is the idea of the families, and remembering that when you're talking about an educational team, when you're talking about an IEP team, families are an equal member of that team. They should be playing a constant role. They know they're the experts on their child, they know the most details about their child, and their values and cultures need to be respected as well, so they have to have a significant amount of input into the planning that goes on for the interventions for their student. Then you have the obvious players, both your special ed and your general ed teachers. And what can be problematic here sometimes is if you have a student who's in special education programming, sometimes we forget to include a general educator, but you really need to have the perspective of a general educator to look at when you can include this child back into the LRE. You need to know what's going on at what level with reading, with math, and so on and so forth, and how could he work toward that general ed classroom. That gen ed teacher really should be collaborating with the special ed teacher to help her understand what she needs to do to get this kid ready to go back into the LRE. And that's a step that we really tend to skip quite a bit when we're looking at kids in the special ed setting. Conversely, we have kids in their general ed setting who tend to be pretty well supported, but if the team is not playing well together, then the special ed teacher might have a habit of pulling the student out for resource room hours and not supporting the student within the general ed classroom or making the appropriate accommodations in that general education classroom. So really what works best is a collaborative sort of teaming approach in working out with those students. Other team members, and these are the ones who tend to be the most forgotten in the collaboration standpoint, are the paraeducators. The thing with paraeducators, and in my area, paraeducators are getting harder and harder to come by because they're less and less willing to pay for them. But what we have this nasty tendency to do is to stick a paraeducator in a room with a student with autism and not give her any training or supervision and just expect her to fix the problem. We need to be inviting paraeducators to all of our planning meetings. We need to be giving them data collection systems. We need to be training them on how to do the evidence-based strategies, and we need to be supporting them and getting their input on every decision that we make. They're in the front lines. They understand what the problems are. If you come up with a strategy or an intervention and say, here, paraeducator, do this, she needs to be able to say, I'd like to do that, but this is going to be a problem because there's a barrier to that you're not aware of. Another pretty key team member, and I'm not just saying that because I am originally a speech-language pathologist, is your speech-language pathologist. Keep in mind that with ASD, one of the primary features of the disability is a language impairment. Oftentimes that's a pragmatic language impairment. That is, it's not so obvious. It tends to be a social language impairment, but there is some kind of a communication impairment. So that therapist can be a key player in designing and implementing and training some of the evidence-based practices for the student with ASD. So she might be in charge of, for example, implementing a self-management system, a 5-point scale, a social story, or on the lower end of the spectrum, she might design and manage the VOCA systems, that's the voice output communication systems, or the augmented communication systems, or the PECS. She might be training various communication systems, and it's her job, by the way, to then train those systems to the other staff members, the classroom teachers, the paraeducators, and so on and so forth, and even do some training with the parents. Some other key players, your occupational therapists, and it really varies wherever you are and how the occupational therapists are used. In some places that I go, the occupational therapist is considered a very integral part of the program, and they've got funding, and the OT is full-time in that building. In other places that I go to, they have some outreach person that comes once a week and gives them some ideas and some strategies. Traditionally, the OTs worked on things like fine motor, dressing skills, lunch skills, and they still do all of that, but now their role has really tended to evolve in people who tend to have a lot of expertise in the area of sensory processing disturbances, and they tend to work on some of the sensory strategies with us. The physical therapists are only involved typically if there's an actual comorbidly existing problem like cerebral palsy or some kind of brain injury or physical injury in which the student requires physical intervention. We don't typically offer physical therapy in the schools unless those conditions exist. You got your psychologists, and in my experience, even within Wayne County, the psychologist role varies greatly. In some of my districts, the psychologists pretty much have time to do suicide assessments and evaluations for eligibility, and that's it. So they're not really part of any of your programming needs. In other districts, your psychologist is very hands-on in the development of behavior intervention plans. So you really kind of have to know how that works in your local district and see what's available to you in terms of your school psychologist. They can be instrumental in developing your functional behavior assessment, helping to develop a behavior plan, sometimes doing some therapies or interventions with kids. They rarely do direct service with kids in my experience, but they can be very supportive to the educational staff. Social workers are really cool players on the team because they can interface for a lot of the family issues that come up. Things like the funding for therapies that families are dealing with, or wraparound services and from community mental health. That's really helpful from a social worker standpoint. Coordinating outside services with the medical interventionist. There are a variety of reasons that you may or may not pull your social worker in, but those psychologist, social worker, PT, school nurse, things like that are what we call situational team members. Extended team members, I should say, where they're on the team, but they're probably not day-to-day players on the team. Then you have your situational team members, which are, people who are a little more rarely called in for very specified things. Like you might call the school nurse in for somebody with a severe seizure disorder, or to train the staff on something like doing diastat or an EpiPen or something. You might have a behavior specialist get called in for students with more severe forms of behavior problems, such as severe self-injury or severe aggression. You might pull a career counselor in when the student is quite a bit older and looking at what are our options, what are the possibilities for this student in the workforce. And switching gears once more to the issues that we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks were also covered in this chapter, so I won't go over them in too much depth, but some of the things that come into play when we are planning and programming for students with ASD are the health issues. Again, the seizure disorders. Again, the sleep disturbances. Again, the gastrointestinal and food allergy problems. Keep in mind, and one of the things they don't really describe is the severe picky eater issue. They talk about the food issues and the gastrointestinal problems, but when I work in a program for students with ASD, not so much in the gen ed variety of kids, but the kids that are moderate to severely impaired, I gotta say 80 to 90% of them are severely picky eaters. And this means that they eat 3 foods, or they only eat white food, or they only eat junk food. They're extremely picky about what they eat. This can be a very problematic situation in your public school setting because of the lunchroom situation. They won't eat at lunchtime. They won't eat during the day because they only eat at their table, at home. They won't eat the granola bar that mom sent from home unless it's opened in a very particular way. They only eat peanut butter, and the kid next to them has a food allergy to peanut butter, to peanuts. So, there are just enormous issues surrounding the picky eater thing that doesn't come into play in this list, but I want you to be aware of that and cognizant of that. And I also would put sleep disturbances way above seizure disorders. My kids have seizure disorders. It's much less common, though, than the food picky eater issue and the sleep disturbance issue. The sleep disturbance issue, again, a huge percentage of my kids do not sleep at night, have very minimal amounts of sleep, which means they and their parents both have significantly reduced amounts of sleep, which severely impacts their behavior, obviously, for obvious reasons. So those are things to take into consideration. The psychopharmacology is a pet peeve of mine, because I think that teachers so often really kind of hang their hat on the idea of give him a pill, he'll be better. If those parents would only medicate him, that kid needs medication when they have kids with severe behavioral challenges. My experience with psychopharmacology and medication is that it pretty much almost never works. It's very rarely effective, and when it is effective, you're dealing with side effects that can be so counterproductive and so problematic that it's not worth the benefit that it has. So I really think about whether you can do things from a behavioral intervention standpoint. It's a lot of hard work, how much more hard work, because the reality of what the medication is going to do, it's not going to be the magic pill that you're hoping for. I gave you the information on the medications that are effective. I can tell you that my biggest, I don't want to say pet peeve again because I've already said it, but one of the problems that I have is the idea of using stimulant medications on kids with ASD, because the side effects tends to make them very irritable, very cranky, have up-down mood swings, and a variety of different issues that, they develop tics, they get all sorts of things that are very frustrating. Also, these stimulant medications like the Ritalins and the Concertas and the Adderalls and so forth do things like they reduce their appetite. Well, I just got done telling you what a big problem the picky eater thing is, and now you're going to give them a medication that causes them to have no appetite? Are you kidding me? Guess what the other side effect is? Sleeplessness. Really? With kids with sleep disorders? However, doctors will say that these stimulant meds are a first-line medication, which means it's one of the first things they try. The reason they try these stimulant medications before they try a lot of the other things is because they're out of their systems within 24 hours. So as soon as the medication wears off, it's not in their blood system. So it's considered sort of a less invasive procedure than some of the other medications. So that's one of the ones that was, there was some documentation that it was effective, as you remember from your last quiz. But the Risperdal is one that if children do have severe behavioral problems, it's an antipsychotic, and it tends to, that one is evidence-based, risperidone I think is the other term for it. That one is evidence-based, and it does have some efficacy for our students with autism, and that's one where I do see a big difference. I really liked the charts that they included in this reading about what does the research say about these different interventions, and it talks about the casein gluten-free diet, it talks about the vitamin B12, it talks about dolphin therapy, and it explains, it gives you that nice table, I think it comes from Teach, it gives you that nice table about what does the research say about those different interventions, and I have also shared that with you on the ASAT website. So something else to consider. And I liked the chart too from Teach, are things to think about when considering these different interventions, and that kind of goes along with some of the stuff that we talked about from the ASAT too. So these are the things that we looked at for considering the placement and the learning and the development of students with ASD. The pieces that you have to take into consideration are what settings would the education happen in, what are the things that you're going to teach the student with ASD, what are you going to do about transition planning, how does the team work well together? These are key issues. What health considerations do you have to keep in mind? And what are the complementary and alternative interventions that you might be using with a student with ASD? That's it on this chapter.